Hi everyone. This is Ryan Kindervater. I'm one of the founding docs here at Sapia Health, and this is Chris Nelson, also one of the founding docs here at Sapia Health. And today we're just going to talk about cholesterol, why you should care about cholesterol, and then really the focus of the video is going to be how you can improve cholesterol with diet. Can you do that? What role does dietary cholesterol and saturated fat have to do with this? What are all these different oils you're always hearing about, omega-3s, omega-6s? And then, when is diet enough? When is diet not enough? When do you need meds and those kind of things? Anything else, Chris?
No, I think that basically sums it up. There's a lot of information out there about cholesterol and lipids and fats, and I think there's a lot of confusion, and hopefully we can kind of simplify that a little bit today. Go over some things, the basics of what cholesterol is and what it does, and then kind of, tell you how to deal with it should you have issues with your cholesterol or lipid profiles.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we'll probably get into the weeds a little bit here, but there should be some indexing down at the bottom of the video. So if you just want to skip ahead and see kind of what the take home is, that'll be on there. Um, Chris, why don't you tell us just like what is cholesterol? Why should we really care about it? And what are the
Yeah,
various like components? Because it's kind of a big term with a lot of little components, and that can be really confusing.
so many little components, and it's a pretty cool thing, really. And I think when you think about cholesterol, the overwhelming, first impression is, oh, it's bad. But, as we get into it, I think you guys will hear that, without cholesterol, you couldn't live. It has a lot of different functions in the body, and it's pretty cool when we dive in. But basically, cholesterol itself is it's a waxy substance, and that floats around your bloodstream and these little, spherical particles called lipoproteins. And it can come from the diet, or it can come from the production within your body within the liver.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the cells in your body can produce it as well. Um, when you break it down, the things that probably a lot of people are, have heard of before is you have basically the two main types of cholesterol. You have your low density lipoproteins, which is the LDL, and
Mm-hmm.
then your
And
high
that's
density
the
lipoproteins, which are the
bad one, right?
HDL. That's the bad guy. The LDL is the bad guy.
Yeah.
And there's, along with the cholesterol, since we're kind of diving into fats and lipids, and there are other molecules of fat that do circulate through your body, and one of those other big ones that you've probably have heard about is your triglycerides.
Yeah.
And it's just another way for the body to transport lipids through the body within the blood. And it's actually, triglycerides are the thing that makes up most of the adipose tissue, or the fat that's on your body that you think of as like your fat.
That's kind
Um,
of triglycerides are kind of like we think of, energy currency, or that's kind of like your body's sort of long-term energy currency, right? Like almost like a
it's
bond
the
or
bank.
something.
Yeah,
Whereas
it's like the
like
bank.
maybe like glucose is like cash.
Hmm. Yeah, this is the bank. It's the
Yeah.
storage. It's in the
Yeah.
vault. Sometimes it's hard to get it out of the vault, which is what we all want to do. But
Hmm.
but yeah, it's lipids are cool. They're really complex. Cholesterol itself, is the production of it is 37 different chemical um, processes. And this is actually where a lot of within the production of it is usually where a lot of the medications, the statins that you probably know about or have heard of, intervene, and it stops the production of cholesterol. But
Hmm.
beyond that a little bit, I think to talk about kind of the positive aspects of cholesterol, or why we need it, it has
Hmm.
a lot of uses in the body. One of the big ones is that every single cell, the membrane of the cell, is basically a cholesterol membrane, and that helps with keeping it fluid. And it's why we can move around. For instance, like a plant or a tree, if you think about it, it's rigid. The
Hmm.
cellular makeup of a plant is a rigid cell wall.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Right. Right.
Most of our cells, though, need to be fluid and need to be able to move, and so cholesterol is actually what allows that to happen, and
Interesting.
it allows our cells to change shape and divide. And you know it's not static. Like, think about a tree. We're much more mobile and fluid. So super important.
Is that is that why cholesterol is really only in animal foods in terms
Yeah,
of
that's
the?
that's a huge reason. That's a huge source
Mhm.
of the cholesterol that you get. You know, like we were talking about, triglyceride is going to kind of be that fat component, and then the cholesterol component um, is really like, you know, when you're eating meat, the cells of that animal are comprised of a lot of cholesterol, and that's where it does come from. Yeah.
Gotcha.
That's why very low cholesterol in plants, like you don't see it very often. There are a few foods that have it and some bacteria that have it, but it's mostly
Uh-huh.
an animal product
Right, like a
source.
plant sterol ester, something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah, and
Um,
I oh sorry, you have more stuff? Keep going.
yeah, some other cool uses in the body. One of the major ones is that, you know, you think of it as the neurons of your body, which are the cells that conduct electrical impulses that tell you what to do and move your muscles and get around. Think of them like an extension cord, where the
Hmm.
inner part is where the electricity travels along the inside of the neuron, but the outside is covered in a sheath composed
Yeah.
of cholesterol, and it's a really good insulator. And without it, you get, you know, it's in the case of like multiple sclerosis where that outer layer breaks down, that cholesterol layer breaks down. It's like putting an electric wire in a bucket of water. Like it's not a focused conduction or
Mm.
electric impulse. And so you're really like, your brain could not tell the rest of your body what to do, because it couldn't get the signal there if you didn't have that cholesterol insulation around those neurons. Um,
So
which is
yeah,
pretty
kind of
cool.
the TLDR
Yes.
is yeah, you don't want to have a heart attack. Heart attacks suck. Having a stroke sucks, and
Hmm.
cholesterol does play a component in that. Um, but it's also, you could call it a, essential nutrient, or it is a nutrient
Hmm.
that our body can make, but certainly we need it to some degree, right? It's not
Yeah,
a, it's
big
not,
degree.
it's not black and white. Unfortunately, that would be so much easier.
For real. Three other quick ones that we'll just, you know, kind of mention is that every hormone in your body has
Hmm.
a cholesterol backbone and made of cholesterol. You know,
Yeah.
your estrogen and testosterone, probably ones that people know of the most
Hmm.
commonly, but all the hormones that are kind of go throughout your body to tell, you know, your cells what to do is comprised of cholesterol, as well as your skin. Like if you didn't have cholesterol in your skin, you would not be waterproof, and you really want to be a
Huh.
waterproof. It's good to be a waterproof for both
Waterproof is
ways, like
good.
losing water evaporation wise, and, you know, every time you went out in the rain, if you didn't have cholesterol, you just soak up water, and that wouldn't be good either. And then the
Interesting.
last one is bile, for digestion purposes. It's kind of like the body's way of recycling cholesterol,
Hmm.
sends it to your gallbladder, and then when you eat, it allows you to absorb other fatty foods. So
Hmm.
it has a lot of different roles, from insulation to signaling pathways to digestion to waterproofing. It's pretty cool. It's in a diverse way that it's used throughout the body.
Isn't it? I just love, we were talking about doing our kind of research updates for this video, and just, I mean, it's so simple, like cholesterol, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, like we just want to talk about, I feel like, I'm interested in, genomics and, making risk scores, polygenic risk scores for heart disease, and looking at what are the genetics of how you metabolize things like folate. And everyone wants to talk about rapamycin and cold plunges, and those things are awesome,
yeah,
and
it's all
I think they're
awesome.
really cool. But um, then to just go back to the basics of cholesterol, and
Cholesterol.
how does saturated fat impact your, cholesterol level, and how does the cholesterol level actually impact your
Yeah,
cardiovascular risk? I think this is one of the foundations of, kind of total health, or, longevity. I don't know that a lot of people think of cholesterol or statins as a quote longevity medicine, but I really think that cholesterol management is a huge, really just a huge foundation for that. And then you can
yeah,
add all the cool, fun stuff on top of that once you've, made sure that you're not, you don't have a total cholesterol of like 380 and a ApoB of 120.
I agree. I mean, when you think about it, you know, like top causes of death in the United States: heart attack and stroke.
Still, yeah, still,
Probably when we're talking about longevity, want to make sure that we have those two things covered before we move on to stuff like you were talking about, like the cold plunges and rapamycin and kind of the more
yeah,
fun and interesting, aspects of kind of regenerative medicine and
yep,
longevity type medicine. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is interesting though that cholesterol. I had never thought about it that way that you put it. That it's both structural and and it's also a messenger.
hmm
So imagine that's like saying you can also use your iPhone to build a house. You can.
totally.
It's wild.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Um, right on. Well, I figure we'll talk a little bit about some studies and kind of because our foundation at Sapia Health is, uh, our reference on top of our motto and where we start our meetings and end our meetings is it true? And
Yeah.
so we really have that commitment to, truth and integrity. And, we don't want to recommend anything without it actually being evidence based. So I figured we would talk a little bit about the evidence behind this, right?
Yeah. Super
Because,
important.
yeah, and I even, I see a lot of confusion. I was just watching a Joe Rogan not too long ago where he mentioned that saturated fat had been vilified and bacon was actually good for you, and I think he had gotten a little confused on saturated fat versus cholesterol in the diet. Um, and so I think we'll go through that real quick and just take a look at what's the data actually say. And there's always potential for bad actors in the research world, right? Like there's always
Yeah.
potential
100,
for a conflict of
totally.
interest, but I think the pattern will become clear that there are some things that like dietary cholesterol that we probably don't need to pay that much attention to. And then there are some things like fatty acid content in our diets that we really should pay attention to in a like kind of whole foods, thought process rather than necessarily micronutrient process when we're at the grocery store or something like that.
Yeah. Really
So
important distinctions.
yeah, it's kind of crazy. It's 2023, and this all started in the 1940s.
Yeah.
We didn't really know what caused heart disease or what our dietary contribution was until basically someone in Massachusetts from I forget what the original research organization was. Boston University now took it over, but essentially some researchers in Massachusetts chose Framingham, which is a small town, small medium sized town outside of Boston.
hmm
Um, they chose this as a town to go get 5,000 people, and basically they'd follow them. They'd take a look at all sorts of aspects of their lives, like did you smoke, did you have kids, how much did you drink, what did you eat, all these things. Do some lab tests on them, which they didn't have really nuanced lab testing, but they're in Massachusetts, so the medical hub of the universe at the time, and maybe even still now. Uh, over in Cambridge was there, and so they came up with this Framingham study, and you'll hear a lot of people, including physicians, talk about quote the Framingham study. That's kind of like red flag for me
Yep.
because if you call it the Framingham study, there's like thousands of studies from this data set. Okay. And then
Yeah.
there
It's
are
huge. They looked at everything.
multiple data sets. So there's no one Framingham study. Okay. There are some landmark papers. That's for sure. But, basically the first ones, they started out in the 60s and they said, okay, turns out, and Chris, I don't know, like make sure you're sitting down for this. Turns out smoking's not good for you.
Really.
Yeah, I think that was Castle. Yeah, smoking's not good for you. They found that the more saturated fat and cholesterol you ate, the higher cholesterol levels you had in your blood were, the higher your blood pressure was. If you had findings of what they call left ventricular hypertrophy, basically your heart kind of getting bigger on an
hmm
EKG, they saw those and they said, well, you're a lot more likely to die of a heart attack and have heart failure from those things. And so the very first recommendation that came out of that was you got to limit your cholesterol, eat less cholesterol, and it really makes sense, right? Like, and in fact, I grew up learning that you can't eat X, Y, and Z because it's got high cholesterol. Don't eat butter; it's high in
hmm
cholesterol. We got to get margarine. Got to get. I can't believe it's not butter instead, which it turns out is like total poison.
Terrible. It
It's
is
probably the
poison.
worst thing. Yeah, I don't want to spoil alert for anyone that's watching, for all two people that are watching, but that stuff's not good for you.
No.
Um, so anyway, so Framingham in the 60s basically put a cap on cholesterol, saying you don't want to eat more than 300 milligrams of cholesterol a day, right? Um, and then that kind of persisted for a long time. In 1968, they're actually going to shut down the study because they thought we've learned, it's the 60s, we've learned absolutely everything we can
We've reached the
about,
peak.
yeah, we know everything there is to know about heart disease. And so they were going to shut it down, and Congress actually stepped in and they were funding it. And they said, no, we're not going to, what? No, there still seems to be at least a little bit more we can learn from this.
Yeah, that's wild.
So then they actually came up with I believe they call it the Framingham cohort or offspring. I forget the name of it, but basically it's the kids of the original group. And they analyzed the data set in the 70s, I think 71 on them. And they actually came up in 83 with a landmark paper that looks at cholesterol levels and ratios. So that's kind of the first time that split of LDL, HDL really came into play in a really big landmark, meaningful way. And
Yeah.
they defined some ratios, um, basically like total cholesterol to HDL, LDL to HDL. 6-to-1 ratio, 4-to-1 ratio, and we still use those in cholesterol screening. And I bet if you go to a lot of primary care doctors, that's probably where it starts and ends. Is you're going to get your total cholesterol, you get your HDL, LDL checked. They will, almost surely look at that ratio. I really hope so. And pretty much if you're under those ratios, 0.25 or 4-to-1 LDL to HDL, as long as your total number is not too crazy,
It ends
that's going to
there.
be it. That's it.
Yep.
That's it. Thanks for coming. Um, and I think that's still a thing to look for. I don't want your HDL ratio to be, zero point 0.1 to your LDL or anything like that.
There's just
But
more
there's
to the
definitely
story. Yeah.
so much more to the story. It's just like splitting the atom. It turns out there's quarks and all sorts of other, I'm not a physicist, but there's all sorts of other smaller particles in there that go infinitely smaller. And that's kind of the cholesterol story too.
Hmm.
Um, but what's kind of interesting is the real question is, okay, so dietary cholesterol, does it matter or not? What do you think, Chris?
To a degree.
I think, yeah, all of
To a
this is to a
degree.
degree.
Yeah.
It seems, and so eggs are kind of the best food to look at this with.
They're
And
bad. They're
again,
good. They're bad. They're good. We've heard it for like what, 20 years now,
yeah, I
at
mean, and you
least.
still see those egg white containers, right, in the store,
Yeah.
um, where it's just egg whites. Get rid of the yolks. So it's 2023. There are robots like vacuuming the house wherever you're at. Cars are like, depending on who you believe, they're about to drive themselves completely.
Uh-huh.
You know, the you can get internet from space.
Hmm.
We're You're in New Hampshire, I'm in Wyoming, and we're talking in 4K video right now, or at least
Hmm.
supposed to be. But we still can't decide if eggs are good for us.
It's ridiculous.
It's insane. So, spoiler: the eggs seem to be pretty good for you, actually,
Hmm.
at least a certain amount. And I've got some study notes, but basically, just over and over again, you look at eggs, and you and they're an ideal food to study because they are really high in cholesterol, but they're not really that high in saturated fat compared to say like a hamburger,
Right.
steak, something like that, ground beef. And so you can kind of isolate to an extent. You can isolate the cholesterol portion without going crazy with the saturated fat. And what's been consistently shown is that your cholesterol intake doesn't really influence negatively your overall cholesterol count or even the micro metrics that we like to look at, like ApoB. And in fact, a lot of times what happens is as you increase your egg intake, so you increase your cholesterol intake, your some of the ratios actually improve. So the HDL to LDL actually improves. The LDL particle size actually gets bigger as you consume eggs. And that's actually important. The LDL, quote, the bad cholesterol, when it's really small, the theory is it can get into those blood vessels easier. And it's because that has a higher surface area to volume ratio, because small particles kind of have high surface area, bigger particles have less surface area relative to their volume. they actually have a lot more surface area available for oxidation and inflammation that actually causes these cholesterol plaques to build up and then
Yeah.
either
Lead
narrow
into the
blood
heart
flow or
attack.
pop and then give you a big, ST elevation, MI, huge heart attack, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out dietary cholesterol intake, not a big factor at all, and you should not shy away from having cholesterol in your diet. It is
Now,
not the
should
biggest
you
thing.
eat 12 eggs a day every day for a year?
That's a good question. So 12 seems like a lot. I don't know that I want to eat 12 eggs. Um,
Man, no one would want to be around you either if you did.
yeah, yeah. So I don't personally want to eat a dozen eggs a day. But I do eat eggs most days, and I think I'm doing pretty good. And then if you look at the data, it backs that up. I did find a case report. This was pretty cool from a couple years ago. This guy was in his 80s, ate 25 eggs a day.
Whoa,
Totally
what
normal levels.
happened?
Nothing. He's fine. He's doing great. His cholesterol, they just wrote it up because they thought, wow, this is really cool. Now, what I wish they would have done is done a genetic sequence on him. And then we
Yeah,
could see like, does he simply lack, does he have a PCSK9 genetic mutation? So he simply, um, is always in what's called a negative feedback loop with his cholesterol, where his body's, perceives his cholesterol level as being high and therefore lowers it. I don't know. They didn't get that far into it, unfortunately. But so there are some medical heroes out there eating 25 eggs a day and doing an N of one experiment for us, Chris. But
yeah.
um, yeah, and so okay, let's recap because I just kind of did a bunch. I kind of talked about a bunch of stuff. Maybe we went on a rabbit hole there, but basically, cholesterol matters, right? We know that it's tied to stroke and heart attack.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow, the amount of cholesterol you eat doesn't really matter. It might actually improve it. So that's kind of wild. So then, what's really left with our diet? What we can do about it? I think the next thing's saturated fat. And do you want to talk a little bit about what saturated fat is versus unsaturated? I know you're kind of
Yeah, there's a
talking about that
couple,
earlier.
when you talk about fats and fats in the diet and the things that you get, there's kind of like three main types. You have your mono unsaturated fatty acids, you have your polyunsaturated fatty acids, and then you have your saturated fats, which is the one that, most people think about in terms of like kind of being the worst of the
Okay.
worst of the three. And then you
Hmm.
have your trans fatty acids, which is basically
That's like chemicals, right?
highly
That's
processed, form of fat that, initially was being put into foods as a form of lowering the saturated fat content,
right,
but it
right.
turns out that stuff is extremely toxic
Because they're
and bad for you.
because kind of the thing with saturated fats, right, is they're solid at room temperature more or less,
Mm-hmm.
or they are more solid,
Yep.
whereas unsaturated fats are less solid.
Mm-hmm.
And there's like a chemical reason to that, but basically that is what it is. And then those trans fats, that was kind of a like loophole where they recreate the solidity at room temp, right? Like Crisco, things like that, but without technically being saturated. And that's more or less just like a lab product, right? Like there exists a tiny amount of trans fat in nature, but it's
Very
overall
small.
like it's
Yeah.
it's it's a essentially like an accidental byproduct of regular fat production and is like an inconsequential amount.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And they formed it to kind of bypass the saturated fat thing, and people were for a while. Remember, they were putting them in chips, and people were eating a
Hmm.
whole bag of chips and having really bad GI upset and really bad,
Oh,
you
that's
know,
right. Yeah, yeah, I remember that.
really
Yeah,
bad GI upset.
yeah, yeah.
Because I don't think it was absorbed well in the body, because the body didn't really recognize it, and it was in the wrong, conformation to be absorbed and taken up, and then it led to some GI problems. So, um,
Yep, I remember those Pringles when they came out. Yeah, they had those
yeah,
those artificial sterol esters, and
uh huh,
yeah, they're just and trans fats. It was like a science project gone wrong.
hmm
Yeah,
so
so saturated fat. So it's kind of usually animal fats, but things like coconut oil, There are, those sort of more equatorial plants that get distilled down and turned into oils, palm, coconut, etc.
Hmm.
Those can definitely be saturated naturally without that hydrogenation or transfatification.
Let's talk about
Um,
hydrogenation just for a minute. I think that's
yeah, yeah,
important. I'm glad you
yeah.
brought it up now. So hydrogenation basically is when you take a mono or polyunsaturated fat and you bubble hydrogen through it.
Okay.
And
That
what
sounds
that
good.
does, it sounds, yeah, super
That
healthy,
sounds
highly
great.
processed. Um, and what that essentially does is it makes it more of like a Crisco,
Yeah.
a can't believe it's not butter, a
Also sounds good.
margarine, and it takes a liquid fat, like these oils, or they used to be healthy oils, and it turns them
Hmm.
into a more of a solid at room temperature. It gives them a longer shelf life, so they don't go rancid. When they talk
Right.
about rancidification, that's when oils go bad after a certain
Yeah.
amount of time, or fats, and it
Uh-huh.
prolong their shelf life. So, like,
Yeah.
it's why Crisco. If you think about Crisco, you can put it in your cupboard unrefrigerated. It's basically just
Oh
like a
yeah.
tub of fat that people love to cook with or used to cook
Yeah.
with. Terrible for you. Um, and so I think that's an important point to make, is that the hydrogenated, you see hydrogenated, it's a processed, highly processed fat
Yeah.
that you should probably always stay away from. I can't think of any that are considered to be healthy in the diet.
No. And it's crazy. Like that point, we'll get to saturated fats and whether or not they affect your blood cholesterol levels, because that is important. But yeah, what you're saying, it just brings to light and I don't think this is a secret now, but it brings to light the fact that this whole food system is designed around making bullshit in a factory somewhere and
Hmm.
then packaging it in really nice, colorful packaging that is
It's healthy.
super
Yep.
appealing to our caveman minds.
Hmm.
And then and it's engineered so you can't stop eating it.
Yep. Highly
It's like,
addictive.
that goes back to the explosive diarrhea Pringles, where it's just like,
I'm gonna eat a
they
thousand.
they were they were so good you couldn't stop eating them.
Yeah,
But
and
yeah,
that's
it's
I
just
think that's something we should mention too, is fats in the diet. When your body, your tongue, realize that there's a fat, and a concentrated form of a fat, it
mhm.
sends signals to your brain like this is a good energy source. And that goes way back to caveman days, when
Yeah,
it was really important to get a high volume of like high density calories and fats in the
yeah,
diet just to stay alive.
yeah,
And so we never lost that instinct to like, hey, now those fats are available everywhere. They're on every shelf. They're in every store. The convenience stores. They're marketed everywhere, and it is addictive. It tells
yeah,
your body's telling itself, hey, I need more of this, because we still haven't lost that survival mode. Hunter gatherer. We need high density caloric intake to
yeah,
live, and so that is where that you know addiction type behavior and potential and desire for those foods comes from, which I think is
yeah.
interesting. And they t-
Also,
and
it's
they take advantage of that, with the
yeah.
marketing and with
Oh,
all of
yeah.
it.
Well, and it's combined with sugar. So,
Mm.
I mean, I think you and I have talked about this. I mean, what is it about? If you have a fatty steak or a piece of fish, right? Like, I can have a relatively small piece of salmon with
Yeah.
some greens for dinner. I'm totally good. Like,
Yep.
I don't have a desire for any more food. It hits that satiety signal like that.
Yep.
But you put that same amount of fat with sugar. You mix it up with sugar and, some non-sugar simple carbohydrate, like a Chips Ahoy cookie. I have no desire to go buy Chips Ahoy cookies, but if you put a box or a bag in front of me, I
Gone.
will, I'll demolish it. We are probably going to get assassinated by like Nabisco after this, by the way.
Potentially.
We've dropped a lot of brand names. A
A lot of
lot of brand
products.
names. Yeah.
I think that's an
Um,
important thing to hit on too, is, going back to when you were talking about the studies and the kind of they said, hey, wow, saturated fats and cholesterol is really bad
yeah.
for you. Low fat. And what did they
Yeah.
do is the food companies took out the fat and replaced it with sugar.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
let's talk about why they did that, because
mhm,
because I think they marketed that in a way that was irresponsible. But
mhm.
there was a
Completely.
basis behind that that I think was motivated incorrectly, but let's just talk about saturated fat and cholesterol. So um, saturated fat is probably the number one contributor that you can adjust in your diet
Hmm.
that will affect your cholesterol levels. So your LDL to HDL ratios, et cetera, particle size. So, um, I was reading as I was doing my literature search on this just to update and make sure I wasn't missing anything. I found this. There's a like a conspiracy theory online right now, and
No
it's
way.
actually there's essentially one person that's very vocal. They wrote a book on this topic, and they got an article published in a peer review journal. I don't even want to say it. It's not. It has a really nice name. I've never heard of it before, but basically, they say that the initial studies on saturated fat and heart disease were flawed because the scientists got paid basically by food industries um, to say that there was a link between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease and cholesterol in an attempt to sell like carbohydrates and carbohydrate based foods. I wouldn't put it past those food companies to do it, and maybe it happened
No.
once. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, right? This person's not an academic. They don't have any credentials. So I'm going to go ahead and say I don't buy it, but let's say it's true. Um, there are literally hundreds of thousands of study subjects that have verified over the subsequent years that have been published in like high quality peer reviewed journals that have been vetted that do show there is 100% a link between saturated fat and cholesterol levels. The question is, how much?
Hmm.
So, as it turns out, if you reduce your saturated fat intake, and that's primarily like, animal products, right? Especially, especially ground beef would be like a really high saturated fat food. Chicken, you can look
Butter,
at, yeah, but yeah,
cheese,
exactly.
ice cream.
Cheese, exactly.
Oh, the ice
All of
cream.
those are pretty high saturated fat content, pretty high cholesterol content. Not that we're not that worried about the cholesterol. We're more worried about the saturated fat.
Hmm.
But um, if you look at all those, it kind of starts with beef at the top and then, chicken, yada, yada. Um, fish usually they do have some saturated fat, but there's a lot of those monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, especially fats that you talked about as being important. And so essentially, the best thing that you can do is bring saturated fat down and replace it with polyunsaturated and monounsaturated fats from
Totally.
fish, nuts, etc. The less
Hmm.
processed, probably the better. Olive
Absolutely. We'll
oil,
get into that.
yeah, olive oil and avocado oil, as far as processed fats go, that's probably as
Hmm.
processed as you want to go, and
Yep.
then
Pressed.
there's the seed oil debate, which probably has more to do with the ratios of those fats than and the fact that those quote seed oil um, products are typically like you're talking about on the shelf. They're
Highly
packaged foods,
processed.
processed. There's a lot of other stuff going on. But what's interesting, Chris, is there is a uh, there is a floor to the impact that saturated fat can have. So it's actually, and this is across many many studies, the kind of recurring number that comes up is about 9% of your calories coming from saturated fat. Which, do you off the cuff know what that would mean in terms of? I don't,
Almost
and
none.
I do this stuff all the time. It's actually not that bad.
No.
So it's not almost none actually. It's actually pretty reasonable. So for a 2,000 calorie diet, you can have 20 grams of saturated fat. So that would mean you'd get 180 calories from that.
Hmm.
If you're 3,000 calories, so some of our more active patients are definitely like a 3,000 calorie basal metabolic rate. I mean, it's not that hard to get there if you're you know a full grown male, right? That's a 30-gram saturated fat intake. It's pretty easy to keep it under that, honestly. Um, you can't eat pork belly every, you know,
No.
breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but yeah. So if
Yeah, I was
you,
thinking more in terms of, you think of it like the typical American diet. I
oh
think keeping it under 20 or 30 grams of saturated fat a day probably wouldn't happen. But somebody
yeah,
that's more conscious or that we're working with, or, like you said, I don't think that's a hard goal either,
Yeah.
but it
I,
takes some
I,
conscious effort for sure. And, you know,
yeah, I don't know what one trip to McDonald's is on that scale, but I bet you're going to ring that bell like that,
I think so too.
unfortunately, because those fries
Hmm.
are good
Hmm.
and they are trans fatty acids,
Hmm.
unfortunately.
They get in your nose and you just have to get them.
Yeah. Um, but so what the data shows over and over again is the best thing to replace those saturated fatty acids with is not carbohydrates, like you're talking about, like with this whole thing that happened in the 80s and 90s where fat got demonized and in all processed foods, basically fat was replaced with carbohydrate, really simple carbohydrate.
Yep.
And that's the absolute worst thing you can do.
Because it's
It's showed
also,
over and
since
over
we're talking
again.
about cholesterol, it's the building block for cholesterol, right? Like you're going to
Yeah,
have
tell me
that
about that.
carbohydrate intake or alcohol, which affects triglyceride levels. Um, and that carb is going to be the building block for your cholesterol. Um,
Or at least for your fatty acids, right? For
mhm.
your lipoprotein. Maybe not for
Mhm.
your cholesterol, but for your
True.
lipoprotein even. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess those triglycerides, we do call that is a component, right, of the total cholesterol. And that is sort of, I think, what you're alluding to, or what you just said, is that those triglycerides go up. Carbohydrates are converted to triglycerides really simply and really easily. And that's kind of the preferred state of any excess carbohydrate in the body, right? So
Yep.
this isn't a fats are bad, carbs are good. This isn't a carbs are bad, fats are good episode, but that's the reality, right?
Hmm.
Did you want to talk a little more about the PUFAs, the MUFAs,
Not
the
those, but
omega 3s, omega 6s?
I think the next good step is the omegas.
Let's go
Typically
omega.
let's go omega. There's three that we all think about.
Wait,
There's
hold on though, because I always get this confused. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but omegas are those
essential.
PUFAs or are those MUFAs?
Uh,
They're
they
PUFAs, right?
are. It depends. So
Because isn't
omega
that what the?
3
Mhm.
and 6 are PUFAs.
Okay,
Omega 9 is unsaturated.
you just blew my
Um,
mind, dude.
Unsaturated
What's a
fatty
nine?
acid. I mean, um, but it's not an essential one.
Okay,
And so they
well,
all are unsaturated,
okay,
but in the 9 is a little bit different.
okay. Well, let's
Um,
stick with the threes and six because I can't even count that high.
yeah. So omega 3 it's a PUFA, polyunsaturated fatty acid, and it's the one that's the like the health one, right? Like the
Okay,
one that everybody wants to get more of in their
sure,
diet.
yeah. That's like
Um,
fish and stuff, right?
Fish, plants, plant oils,
Hmm.
fish oils, krill.
Okay,
There's a lot in eggs and grass-fed animals, which is
right,
something that
right.
we may or may not touch on in this video, but more
Yeah.
in the grass-fed, animals as opposed to, traditional, conventional agriculture. Um, and the modern diet is pretty low in omega 3.
Hmm.
Um, the next one is omega 6.
Hmm.
That's something that you're going to see in poultry, eggs, again, nuts, seeds. They all kind of come from similar ish sources,
Hmm.
vegetable oils as well.
Right.
And that's much higher in our modern day diet, the 6.
Yeah.
Um, the ratio that you want to aim for from omega 3 to omega 6 is 1 to 1 to 4 to 1, meaning four
Okay.
omega 6 to 1 omega 3.
Yeah.
But the typical diet today is more like 10 or 30 to 1.
I was gonna
Um,
say even in our patients that we see who are pretty on it as far as nutrition goes,
mhm.
4 to 1 with the omega 6 to omega 3 is pretty rare. Like under there, I'd say that's one of the last things people tend to dial in, and it
Yep.
probably especially for heart health and especially inflammation. Chronic inflammation is a big deal for a lot of people, and there's a lot of theory that excess linoleic acid can lead, which is an omega 6, can lead
Exactly.
to increased inflammation. And it's probably right because these omega 6s are going back to the corporate thing. They're pretty cheap to make depending on the source, right?
Mhm. Yeah, they can
Because
be,
it's,
and they're
yeah,
widely available. And again, we might not get into it too deeply here, but the level of processing and
yeah.
the source, especially for omega 3,
Hmm.
if you want to go down this rabbit hole, the smaller the fish, the better. That's why krill is
Yeah.
such a good one,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
very, very small fish. And that has to do a lot with the bioaccumulation of toxic heavy metals. If you're
Yeah.
taking this fat source from a large fish that's eaten, so many other, aquatic life over its lifetime, every time
Yeah.
it takes in a little bit of mercury or those other heavy metals that you hear about mostly in tuna,
Yep. Yeah.
it never loses it. And so it bioaccumulates, meaning it builds up with every meal in its tissues and in its fat. And so if you're getting, omega-3s from a source that's like a large fish,
Hmm.
the concern for heavy metal toxicity and uh, exposure is there.
Right.
But that's kind of another, rabbit hole to go
Yeah.
down,
What's
especially talking about
interesting.
supplementation versus like what you're
Yeah.
going to add to your diet. Sardines great, anchovies great, little fatty fish is great.
Yeah.
Trying to get the bulkier omega-3 from like tuna and other large fishes
Yeah. It's
can
probably not a
be,
great idea.
if it's an untested, some of the tunas and salmons out there now are tested, every one of them, for heavy metals. um, it can be safer to do it that way, but you want to really be sure to find your sources and how they're caught and how they're processed, and if they are heavy metal tested. Really important.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I was thinking about this because in everything I've read, the benefit of eating fish, a fatty fish twice a week, that's sort of the baseline level that the dietetics and nutrition community is sort of settled on as a baseline. And you can improve that for sure. You can go up from there, which
Mm-hmm.
might be a good thing. But 2 times a week is a good goal to shoot for, and kind of using what you're talking about, smaller fatty fish.
Mm-hmm.
Cod and haddock are another good option depending on where you're at. Um, but what's interesting is, when you take a fish oil supplement, in studies that just hasn't been that cardiovascular benefit of avoiding stroke and heart attack has just never been demonstrated to be anywhere near as good, if even existent, when you take the pills.
Yeah,
And
there's
it's
a
a weird,
lot
it's
of
weird. It's yeah, it's very strange. And
there's a lot
then
of conflicting and poor. No, I wouldn't say poor data, negative data. Like it
yeah,
doesn't help with like you're talking about stroke and heart uh,
yeah,
and um, issues, but it can overall, decrease inflammation markers, and we kind of talked a little bit whether
yeah,
that's actually beneficial or not. It may reduce incidence of dementia
hmm
before onset, but it has seems to have no effect after the onset of dementia.
yeah, yeah,
There might be some uh, high blood pressure reduction benefits. Some cancers seem to be affected, um, but it's overall, I don't think it's the shining gold star that we thought it would be, supplementation wise.
yeah, yeah. I think definitely, yeah. The bottom line is eat fish twice a week for sure. Be careful which
Mm-hmm.
fish you eat. This info is all over the internet. You can definitely find it. It's not a secret. And then the other thing that's interesting, Chris, in this last year, there's been an explosion of data on omega-3, basically like hyper supplementation, and
Yeah.
atrial fib risk. And there is, I think, no question now, when you are taking these supplements that have super high DHA, super high EPA, which are those omega-3 downstream products that you get for after ingesting these omega-3s, when you take them in super, super high numbers, your AFib risk goes way up. And that right there's a stroke risk. And I don't know about you, I certainly don't want atrial fibrillation. So yeah,
No.
I've been steering people away from these fish oil supplements for years, and just because it doesn't seem to replicate the dietary intake that you get from whole fish, or the improvement you get from eating the whole fish.
Mm-hmm.
And then now with this, I think it's just more reason to stick to that sort of baseline recommendation of a couple servings a week, maybe four, and then don't. It's like everything else. Um, water's great, right? You got to drink water, but if you breathe it in, too much water will kill you. It's a very
Yeah.
dangerous substance.
If you chug a gallon, your brain's going to swell and you're going to die.
Yeah, exactly.
Anything can be a
Yeah,
poison, even water and air.
yeah, exactly. So, all right, we covered fish, we covered saturated fat, we covered MUFAs, we covered PUFAs, we covered omega 3s, sixes. I'm still not sure what nines are.
Oh, so nine. Let's go over nine real quick.
Yeah, what are nines?
Nine, nine is not an essential fatty acid.
Then I don't want it. I only want essential ones.
Your body can produce it in different ways. You can get it in other ways besides your diet. And our diets tend to be really high in omega-9 to begin
Oh,
with.
really?
And it's an animal fat derivative and some of the vegetable oils. But it
Mm,
does, if you do have a low level or dietary intake of omega-9, your body seems to be able to make enough to make up for that. Hence the non-essential
gotcha.
fatty acid like omega-3 and omega-6, which we really can't produce in enough quantities to sustain us in our health.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. I did want to talk about. I want to talk about when diet's not enough to move these numbers down because as you can see on our list of tools here, like let's say you have high cholesterol and maybe you have a little bit of cleaning up you can do in your diet or little things you can change. Okay, so now you're telling me, I mean, one thing's good is, okay, I don't necessarily have to worry about the cholesterol number I eat, but that also sort of takes a tool out of my belt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, like, that's kind of unfortunate because it means, all right, I can reduce my cholesterol intake to really low numbers and it probably isn't going to affect me positively.
May not
Well,
help.
so that's a bummer. And then saturated fat, not saying we should just eat all the saturated fat we can, but 30 grams of saturated fat a day for a 3,000 calorie diet for an active person, that's a lot of saturated fat. That's actually
That's great.
not that little. Imagine, because a gram is about a spoonful, right? Imagine me just feeding you 30 tablespoons of straight saturated fat. That's a lot.
That
It's
would
not
be
that,
gross.
it's not that small.
No.
So, okay. So
Quick
that's
story. I have a quick story. Can I throw
okay.
one
What's
in?
your quick story?
So prior to med school, I worked for the American Red Cross as a blood draw like assistant, and so I would process the blood draws. And
Okay.
after you get the blood vials back into the cooler, into the ice, they start to fractionate
Oh
and
yeah. Yeah.
separate. And it was amazing that some of those blood vials, by the time
Mhm.
half an hour went by, would be half full, and the top of it would look like the cream layer on the top of like old milk. It would
Mm.
be the red bloody and plasma section down below, and then the top would just be a yellow solid layer of lipids. And you knew the people that went to McDonald's before they came in and gave blood, or had like ate like a pound of bacon, because it would literally separate out of the blood, and it would comprise half of the tube of the vial of blood. And
Nice.
it's kind of gross, but
Yeah, I
yeah.
may have done that when I was in med school for my titer screening labs and gotten a really anxious phone call from the nurse practitioner at the clinic, and we went back in and didn't have an egg McMuffin before.
What do you have for breakfast?
Yeah,
An
no, she
entire
didn't.
pig.
She wanted to start me on a statin infusion that day, but yeah, we got it back. I fasted the next day and it was fine. But
It's awesome.
um, yeah, let's see what we're getting. Oh yeah, so we have kind of like limited tools,
Sorry.
right? No,
Yep.
that's great. No, we have kind of limited tools to deal with this whole thing of how do we reduce our cholesterol to an acceptable level and minimize our cardiovascular risk of stroke and heart attack, because that's the whole goal, right? And yeah, there's a floor to the saturated fat. There's not much you can do with your cholesterol intake. You can eat some fish, eat nuts, clean up your diet. And then I think something that comes up a lot now is, does intermittent fasting or time restricted eating affect this?
Hmm.
Um, and if you listen to Huberman, it's sort of like the panacea. It almost sounds like, if you listen to that episode, and it almost sounds too good to be true. But looking in the data, it actually, time restricted feeding, with or without calorie restriction, does improve a lot of parameters, and definitely it does show improvements in blood lipid levels.
Hmm.
LDL, LDL to HDL. Interestingly, not only does it decrease your total cholesterol in a lot of studied subjects, but it certainly seems to preserve a really good LDL to HDL ratio, which is really important. And it looks like it can improve ApoB as well, which in our practice we use a lot as a pretty important target for statin therapy or diet therapy for cholesterol lowering. So I think time restricted feeding, if you can do it, or if it fits well with your lifestyle, um, it's been studied even a few times a week, 2 to 3 days a week, that it's been beneficial in this. So I think it's another tool in the box It's a
Hmm.
little extreme for a lot of people, but definitely there's potentially some benefit there.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
then, yeah. And then one of the other questions we get a lot, Chris, is keto.
Yeah.
We were just talking about this. I was just talking with a client who really likes keto, feels great on keto, but has a lot of heart disease early in the family and is concerned about that. And if you look at the studies, most of them show that if you do a ketogenic diet, your lipids are going to rise.
Hmm.
But then look at the studies. If you look, a lot of them are biased against the keto. So the keto arm their diet will consist of beef, red meat, bacon, things like that. Um, very little cruciferous vegetables, even though you can 100% eat broccoli on keto and your net carbs will, be low enough to keep you in ketosis. They don't have a lot of that. And then the comparison arm will have, they'll have like a slice of fish a week and then arugula, and they'll say that the lipids really rise with the keto. I was really only able to find a couple of resources looking at a more, Mediterranean keto with fish as a protein source
I find
and a
that
fat
really
source,
interesting.
olive oil, avocado.
Hmm.
And those studies actually showed improvement in lipids. Go figure, they came out of Spain. But
Right.
um, so I think the keto question remains unanswered. I think that one really depends on how you do it. I think if you do it, what we might call a typical American keto, bacon, don't, not donuts, but bacon, steak, things like that. I was thinking of time restricted feeding when I said donuts. Some people get on. I was just reading that Elon Musk book, and there's a chapter in there where they talk about he starts Ozempic, he starts doing time restricted feeding to get his like body weight and lipids under control,
Hmm.
and then he eats one meal a day, and it's donuts and milkshakes, and
Stop.
I'm like,
Really?
I don't think that's how that stuff works. But anyway, so yeah, I think with this keto stuff, I think the devil's in the details, and I just in seeing a couple patients I've had on the Mediterranean keto diet plan that we made for them, I think it's actually been pretty beneficial for their lipids. So I think there's a way to do it. But let's say you do all that. Let's say you optimize your diet, you're intermittent fasting, or you're not. I think it's maybe here or there, and you've gone down to 9% of your calories from saturated fat. You're doing everything else, and still your total cholesterol is high. Your ApoB is like 90, 95. Maybe you smoked for a while, you quit, something like that. Um, I really think there's still a place for statins in that patient, and I think a lot of people. It's not to say you should ignore your diet. I think that's definitely the foundation, but I think the statins they're definitely shown to improve mortality, in a
Hmm.
certain subset of people, right? They are 100% shown to decrease heart attack and stroke. Now, your number needed to treat might be higher. It depends on the person, right? So it's not that every person who takes a statin is guaranteed to not have a heart attack. The NNT number needed to treat might be in the 50s, depending on what group you're in. Um, but yeah, I think statins are definitely still a useful tool, and I think the side effects of muscle pain, um, liver issues. I don't know. I've not seen those very often in the last 10 years. Have
So
you, Chris?
infrequent that you hear about that. Super, and it's a very common drug. You know.
Yeah. I mean, I think atorvastatin's number one selling drug in the world, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. Um, and so, yeah, I think with regular monitoring, I don't think that's a lot of people are really reluctant to get on a statin, and I get it. There's a lot of bad press, but I think they really are useful, and I don't want to push anyone onto them, but man, if your cholesterol's still high, we've optimized your blood pressure, optimized everything else. I think that's really a good consideration.
I think
Um,
it's a really, really reasonable next step. You know.
yeah, and then let's say you have a problem with the statins. There's those PCSK9 inhibitors, which we were talking a little bit about. before, and their mechanism is really cool because it's kind of that feedback mechanism that we see with eggs, where sometimes your dietary cholesterol goes up and your LDL will actually go down, or the
Yeah.
ratios will actually improve. It's basically a feedback mechanism that your liver has. So blood cholesterol goes up from eating a steak or a burger. Your liver's going to sense that. It's going to actually downregulate production of various lipoprotein complexes, and your overall LDL might go down. Your LDL to HDL ratio might improve, and PCSK9 is a little mischievous protein that kind of knocks those receptors off the liver, if you want to think about it like that. And some people express it to variable amounts, but this is actually, people with a genetic disorder, familial hypercholesterolemia. A lot of them have essentially an issue with this PCSK9 where it's overexpressed. And so these PCSK9 inhibitors are a really good option for those people. Or if you can't tolerate a statin for some reason, they just haven't been around long enough to really show that mortality benefit that statins have. So I kind of use them as second line, but they're an injection. The time frame depends on which one you use. There's three of them, but I think they're a really interesting option, and I think this may be where we end up going long term. But for right now, they're still kind of uh, new and not quite as much track record as the regular statins.
Absolutely.
I think those are the big ones. What do you think, Chris? Is there anything else we didn't cover on cholesterol and diet?
A couple things I can think of. You're really big on genetics. How about we talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, yeah. So there are a couple of variants that we would look at in someone who has high cholesterol, or someone who's has a genetic test and is looking to kind of forecast and optimize everything, right? So maybe you're only 30 years old and maybe your diet's pretty good, so your cholesterol is fine, but we want to look and see, well, what's a potential issue down the road?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, essentially there are two places where these genetic variants will come into play. One is at the intestinal absorption level. So how much cholesterol do you absorb from your diet? So if some people will absorb 9% of the cholesterol they take in. Other people absorb 80% of the cholesterol they take in. And
Big
so,
difference.
so that 80% person, that's going to be a really big diet responder, right? That's going to be
Mm-hmm.
the person that if you decrease their cholesterol intake, their saturated fat intake, you're going to see amazing numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, someone in the 9%, you're not going to get that much with diet,
Yeah, not gonna budge.
saturated fat or cholesterol. And then there are folks that do have some variant in, PCSK9 and, some other liver related cholesterol processing and upregulating framework. And, those folks, you can look at, statin response, PCSK9 inhibitor response, things like that. So, and it would kind of depend on this is all really nuanced, right? So we don't want to start anyone on a medication just because they have a variant that's not significant. But this is
True.
where I think a real personalized medicine physician who knows you and has taken the time to get to talk to you, really dig into the family history, look at lifestyle. What can you do? What can't you do? As far as lifestyle changes, I think that's the sort of magic in taking that whole patient approach and actually getting
Mm-hmm.
to know people, and then having the technical knowledge to apply that. That's where you end up on the right medication. That's where you aren't taking any extra medications that you don't need. And and yeah, to plug our service, I think that's what we do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
highly
yeah, if you
personalized.
yeah, so yeah, if you want, I think a personalized experience for this and for other health issues and preventive medicine issues, I think Sapia Health is definitely the way to go. We're gonna actually take our time with you, get to know you, and hopefully get that genetic testing done for you, and take a look and personalize your treatment plans, and come up with a doctor-led nutrition plan too. So
Mm-hmm.
you're not you don't have this disconnected ecosphere that we're all used to in today's healthcare environment. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I'm glad you did.
Completely scattered. Yeah, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, we should have that. We should have that discussion someday. Like, horror tales from healthcare or something.
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool, Chris. Well, that was pretty fun.
Yeah.
I'd say I'm going to go celebrate with like a burger or something, but I'll probably go eat some lentils now.
And a sardine.
Sardine and lentil salad. No, there are a lot of, it's not all sardine and lentil salad. You can still eat pretty good and have enjoyable meals and keep this stuff under control, I think.
That's the thing that's absolutely true. You don't have to, you're limiting some things, but the foods that you have available to you, it's a lot of delicious stuff.
Yeah. I mean, the Mediterranean diet, which have fun defining that, specifically. It's kind of like nailing Jello to the wall, but
Hmm.
um, yeah, I mean, your people are from Greece, and they seem to have a pretty good time, and that's kind of where that came from, right?
They have
So
an awesome time and they eat
yeah,
well.
the food's pretty good. So yeah, I agree. I think there's a lot of ways to do this that are great, and you're just gonna feel better if you eat better.
Hmm.
Even if it didn't affect your LDL at all, even if your heart
Yep.
attack risk was the same, man, you're just gonna feel so much better if you eat better. So yeah,
Hmm.
come get a personalized diet plan from us. You'll feel better.
Way better.
All right, Chris. Been good talking, man.
All right. Thanks, man. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, and there are sources down in the comment section. You'll be able to see
Mhm.
all the peer-reviewed articles that led to this video.
Absolutely.
All right, till next time.
All
Thanks.
right. Later, man.
Bye.